The strong men in control of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, that axis of evil, are notorious for their aggression, and none of them have bothered to keep their hatred of the United States of America a secret. The wolves are at the door, Mr. President, and yet here we are debating a military vaccine mandate that has zero basis in science or common sense. It will gut the ranks of the military and make us more vulnerable to the rising threat from the new axis of evil. This isn't just my opinion, it is another fact confirmed by the people President Biden trusts to lead our nation's military. The Army confirmed in a November 4th press release that the vaccine mandate has already separated 1,796 active duty soldiers from their service. Bear in mind, they raised their hand. They took an oath. They did this because they want to serve, protect, defend. And what has happened? What has happened to that service, to that loyalty? Look at what has happened. They're getting a slap across the face. As I said, 1,796 were shown the door because they would not take a COVID shot. They wouldn't take a shot. For the soldiers who remain, the Army has approved less than 4% of medical exemptions and just over 1% of religious exemptions. The Guard has only approved 15% of the medical exemptions and, get this, 0.0047% of religious exemptions. And the reserves, they've approved a little more than 5% of their medical exemptions and 0.0044% of religious exemptions. Leader Schumer left Washington for the Thanksgiving holiday without acknowledging this manpower crisis in our military and without offering a clear answer on when we will take up the fiscal year 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. Now that we're back in session, I would hope that he has a plan to stop dangling this bill over the heads of our service members and their families. But while we're waiting, I'd like to offer a small improvement to what is already a very strong and bipartisan piece of legislation. Mr. President, as you know, Senate Armed Services Committee finished their work on this bill back in June. When we were debating the NDAA and the Armed Services Committee, I introduced two amendments that would have protected service members from the arbitrary effects of the vaccine mandate. The first would prohibit the involuntary separation of any service member for refusing the COVID-19 shot until each service achieves its authorized end strength. Good common sense. Not saying you can't implement your mandate, just saying you can't do it until you have reached your goal, your recruitment and your retention goals. The second amendment would make sure that members of the National Guard or Reserve maintain access to both pay and benefits while their request for a medical or religious accommodation is pending. My Democratic colleagues on the Armed Services Committee killed these amendments, but I do hope they'll change their mind and support them now that they have had the opportunity to hear from folks back home, to hear from our military, our Guard, our reserves. I hope they'll give this another look. But if they don't, they'll have another opportunity to fix this mistake. I have combined the amendments into a single bill called the Preserving the Readiness of Our Armed Forces Act, and I'd be happy to add each and every one of them as a co-sponsor. As we begin what I'm sure will be a mad dash to the end of the year, I want to encourage my Democratic colleagues to keep preserving readiness at the front of their mind. When the Pentagon first revealed this vaccine mandate, veterans, military experts, and active duty service members up and down the ranks told us exactly what would happen if the Biden administration went through with this. And you know what? They were accurate in their assessment. Because of the Democratic actions, this White House actions, they have fired thousands of service members and tens of thousands more are in jeopardy. Bear in mind, these are people who have chosen to serve. This chaos has prompted thousands of potential soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to decide against entering the service. And who knows how many will choose not to enter the National Guard. The Biden administration is digging in their heels at the worst possible time. The new axis of evil, they are on the rise, and they're counting on the rest of the world to remain complacent. Over the past few years, each of these nations has been exposed on the international stage as factories of repression, violence, and misery. But in the aftermath, nothing changed. Just last week, the CCP reminded us how little value they place on human life. 10 people in Xinjiang burned to death when their apartment building caught fire. The firefighters couldn't get to them in time because of the barricades the CCP officials had constructed to enforce their zero COVID policy. Protesters took the streets and forced the international press to pay attention. In response, the CCP brutalized journalists, censored videos shot the night of the fire, and claimed that the residents who died were too weak to save themselves. I would remind my colleagues that these are the same officials who claim that the Uyghur Muslims are comfortable in their concentration camps, that the Tibetans welcomed ethnic cleansing, and that firing missiles at Taiwan is part of normal military operations. Exposure will not stop them. Outrage will not give them pause, because they are on a quest for global domination. And they're not going to take a time out because the Democrats in control of our government decided to prioritize a shot over our nation's security. Let that sink in. They are going full steam ahead. They're increasing their military ranks. They are building their Navy. They are working to develop new missiles. And we're focused on removing military members because they will not take a shot. And by the way, you can get vaccinated and boosted, and it doesn't keep you from getting COVID. Unfortunately, our adversaries have decided to take advantage of weak leaders in the White House and in Congress and to exploit our vulnerabilities until we force them to stop. Our military is not the only tool we use to keep this country safe, but it certainly has the power to be the most decisive. And I cannot think of anything more foolish than to sabotage it while the enemy watches and says, look at America's